Act 1. The Last Sunrise. Imagine a steel beast so massive that its main guns could hurl a shell the weight of a small car over the horizon. Imagine armor so thick that no other battleship on Earth could penetrate it. This was the Yamato, the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever built by human hands. But in April 1945, this Titan was not a symbol of power. It was a sacrificial lamb. Ordered to sail to Okinawa with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip, the Yamato was sent not to win a battle, but to die gloriously for the Emperor. She was the last great throw of the dice for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and she was steaming straight into the jaws of the American fleet. The crew knew the odds. Over 3,000 men on board. They had written their final letters home. They had held a ceremony on the deck, drinking sake and singing the national anthem. Some were prepared to die. Some were just afraid. None of them could have imagined the scale of the attack that was coming. More than 300 American carrier aircraft were about to be launched. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. They were going to swarm the Yamato and her escorts like hornets. And there was nothing the giant battleship could do to stop them. What followed was one of the most intense naval battles in history. Wave after wave of American planes descended. Bombs tore through the deck. Torpedoes ripped open the hull. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with tracers, but it was like trying to stop a rainstorm with an umbrella. By the end, the Yamato was a flaming wreck, listing so badly that her crew couldn't stand. She capsized. Her ammunition magazines exploded, sending a mushroom cloud thousands of meters into the sky. Over 3,000 men died. The age of the battleship died with them. But to understand why the Yamato was built and why she was sent on this suicide mission, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to the 1930s, when Japan dreamed of ruling the Pacific, and battleships were still the kings of the sea. Act 2. The Floating Fortress. The Yamato was born out of a naval arms race. In the 1930s, the great naval powers, Britain, the United States and Japan, were bound by the Washington Naval Treaty. This treaty limited the size and number of battleships each nation could build. The idea was to prevent another arms race like the one that had led to the First World War. Japan chafed under these restrictions. The Japanese admirals believed that a future war would be decided by a decisive naval battle, a clash of battleship lines, like the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when Japan had crushed the Russian fleet. To win that battle, Japan needed the biggest, most powerful battleships the world had ever seen. In 1936, Japan withdrew from the treaty and began designing a new class of battleship in absolute secrecy. The construction of the Yamato was hidden behind massive bamboo screens and netting. The shipyard at Kure was transformed into a fortress of secrecy. Workers were sworn to silence. Even the Japanese public had no idea what was being built. The numbers alone are staggering. The Yamato was 263 meters long, longer than 2 football fields. She displaced 72,000 tons at full load, making her nearly twice the size of any American battleship afloat at the time. Her main guns were 9 46-centimeter cannons, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a ship. Each gun could fire a 1,460-kilogram shell over 40 kilometers. The armor was equally insane. The Yamato's belt armor was over 40 centimeters thick in places, angled to deflect incoming shells. The turrets had armor plates 65 centimeters thick. The deck was designed to withstand direct hits from bombs. The ship was, in theory, unsinkable. But the Yamato was not just a fighting machine. It was a floating city. Below decks, There were sleeping quarters for over 3,000 men, a fully equipped hospital, a bakery, a barber shop, even an ice cream maker. The officers had their own dining room with fine china and silverware. The Yamato was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and every sailor who served on her knew it. The Yamato was launched in 1940 and commissioned in December 1941, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The timing was ironic. Pearl Harbor had just proved that the age of the battleship was over, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. But the Japanese High Command didn't fully understand this yet. They still believed in the decisive surface battle. For the first year of the war, the Yamato did almost nothing. She was too valuable to risk. She sat at anchor in the Japanese base at Truk, earning the nickname Hotel Yamato among the crew. Sailors joked that the ship's most dangerous enemy was boredom. She was present at the Battle of Midway in 1942, but she was hundreds of kilometers behind the action, never firing a shot. The greatest battleship ever built had become a spectator to the war. Act 3. A changing war. By 1943, the tide of the Pacific War had turned against Japan. The American industrial machine was producing aircraft carriers at an astonishing rate. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway had been won not by battleships, but by planes launched from decks hundreds of kilometers from the enemy. The concept of the decisive surface battle was becoming a fantasy. The Yamato was finally sent into combat in 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she fired her massive guns in anger for the first time. But she was not firing at American ships. She was firing at aircraft. The 46-centimeter guns had special anti-aircraft shells called sanshiki, incendiary shells that were designed to explode in the air like giant shotguns. In theory, they could tear apart whole squadrons of planes. In practice, they were terrifying, but largely ineffective. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the Yamato's first real taste of surface combat. She was part of a massive Japanese fleet sent to destroy the American invasion force in the Philippines. The battle was chaotic and desperate. The Yamato engaged American escort carriers and destroyers, firing her main guns at enemy ships for the first and only time in her career. She scored hits. She helped sink several American ships. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval battle in history, and it was the only time the Yamato fired her main guns at enemy ships. The Japanese plan was desperate. Lure the main American fleet away with a decoy force of aircraft carriers, then strike the landing beaches with a powerful battleship force. The Yamato was the spearhead. At dawn on October 25th, the Japanese force, 4 battleships, including the Yamato, and several cruisers and destroyers, surprised a group of American escort carriers off the island of Samar. These were not the big fleet carriers of the US Navy. They were small, slow ships designed to support ground troops, not fight a surface battle. Their escorts were destroyers and destroyer escorts, tiny ships compared to the Japanese giants. What followed was one of the most lopsided and heroic naval engagements in history. The American destroyers, hopelessly outgunned, charged the Japanese battleships to buy time for the carriers to escape. They fired their small guns, launched torpedoes, and laid smokescreens. The Yamato's massive shells began landing among them. The Yamato scored her first hit on the destroyer USS Johnston, which had been charging at the Japanese line like a terrier attacking a bear. A 46-centimeter shell from the Yamato tore into the Johnston's engine room, cutting her speed in half. But the Johnston kept fighting. The Yamato also struck the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, helping to send her to the bottom. the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. But the Japanese did not press their advantage. The ferocity of the American defense confused the Japanese admiral, Takeo Kurita. He believed he was facing a much larger force. He ordered a withdrawal. The Yamato's one and only surface engagement ended not in victory, but in retreat. The great battleship, built to dominate the seas, had been driven off by destroyers and escort carriers. The irony is bitter. The Yamato's guns were fired in anger only once. They sank ships that, ton for ton, were not even a fraction of her size. And the battle they were designed for, the decisive clash of battleship lines, never happened. The age of the aircraft carrier had already dawned, and the Yamato was a dinosaur. Magnificent, but doomed. By early 1945, the situation was catastrophic for Japan. The American forces were closing in on the home islands. The Japanese fleet was running out of fuel. Most of its aircraft carriers had been sunk. Its air force was reduced to kamikaze attacks, desperate suicide missions flown by young pilots with little training. And yet, the Imperial Japanese Navy still had the Yamato, the unsinkable fortress, the symbol of Japanese naval power. And the High Command decided that if the Yamato was going to die, she should die gloriously. The plan was called Operation 10 Go, Heaven Won. The Yamato and a small escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers would sail to Okinawa, where the American invasion was about to begin. The Yamato would beach herself on the coast and fight as an unsinkable fortress until she was destroyed or ran out of ammunition. It was a suicide mission. The ships were given enough fuel for a one-way trip only. The crew were told they were going to die for the Emperor, but none of them knew quite how quickly that death was coming. Act 4. The Divine Gamble. The night before the mission, the crew of the Yamato held a final ceremony. They gathered on the deck, and the ship's captain, Kosaku Aruga, read out the orders. He told them they were about to make history. He told them that their sacrifice would inspire the nation, and he told them that the eyes of the Emperor were upon them. Then they drank sake. They sang the Umi Yukaba, the naval anthem, a song about dying by the Emperor's side. Some of the men wept, some of them smiled. Some of them just stared at the deck, trying not to think about what was coming. Many of the sailors wrote final letters home. Some of these letters survive. They are almost impossible to read without a heavy heart. One young sailor, a loader in the No. 2 turret, wrote to his parents, "I am sorry I could not be a better son. Please take care of my little sister. Tell her the sea is beautiful, even when it is cold." He was 19 years old. He had never been in love. He had never traveled beyond his home prefecture. He died 3 days later. Another letter, from a petty officer to his wife, read, "Do not wait for me. If you meet someone kind, marry him. But please, once a year, light a stick of incense and think of me." He enclosed a pressed cherry blossom, the symbol of the samurai, beautiful, brief, and destined to fall. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, the 22-year-old officer whose memoir would later become famous, wrote to his mother with a clarity that belied his age. He told her that he was not afraid to die. He told her that he was proud to serve on the Yamato, the most beautiful ship in the world. And he told her that he hoped, in some small way, his death would help bring peace to Japan. "If my life can be a stepping stone for a better future," he wrote, "then I give it gladly." But not all the letters were so serene. Some were angry, some were terrified. One sailor wrote simply, "I do not want to die. I want to go home. Please, someone, stop this." That letter was never sent. It was found in his locker after the ship sank. On the morning of April 6, 1945, The Yamato and her escorts left port at Tokuyama. The sea was calm. The sky was grey. The ships formed up in a line with the Yamato at the center, a steel island surrounded by smaller escorts. The plan was to make a high-speed run south, reaching Okinawa the next morning. But the Americans knew they were coming. Japanese radio transmissions had been intercepted. American submarines had spotted the fleet as it left the inland sea. The commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, Admiral Raymond Spruance, ordered his carriers to launch a massive airstrike. More than 300 planes, Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers, were armed and fueled, ready to go. The American pilots were briefed on their target, the Yamato, the biggest battleship in the world. For many of them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They were going to sink a legend. They were going to make history. The attack was scheduled for the early afternoon of April 7th, and as the sun rose over the East China Sea, the Yamato's crew had no idea that they were already dead men walking. Act 5. Operation 10 Go. At around 10 a.m. on April 7th, the first American reconnaissance planes appeared on the horizon. They circled high above the Japanese fleet, just out of range of the Yamato's anti-aircraft guns. The crew watched them with a mixture of dread and resignation. They knew what those planes meant. The Americans were finding the range. The attack was coming. The first wave of American planes appeared just after 12:30 p.m. Hellcat fighters swept in first, strafing the decks to suppress the anti-aircraft gunners. Then came the Helldiver dive bombers, plunging out of the sky like falling stars, their sirens screaming. And then came the Avengers, torpedo bombers flying low and fast, just above the waves. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened up. The sound was deafening. Hundreds of guns, from massive 12.7-centimeter cannons to rapid-fire 25-millimeter machine guns, filled the air with metal. The sky was thick with smoke and tracers and explosions. But the American planes kept coming. The first bombs hit the Yamato's deck. They tore through the wood planking and exploded below. Fires broke out. The first torpedo struck the port side, sending a column of water high into the air. The ship shuddered. Men were thrown from their feet. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns continued to fire, but the gunners were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Wave after wave of planes attacked. The Yamato was hit again and again. Bombs, torpedoes, rockets. The escorts around her were also being torn apart. The light cruiser Yahagi was hit and began to sink. Destroyers were burning, capsizing, breaking in half. The sea was a chaos of flame and smoke and screaming men. And still the Yamato fought on. Act 6. The Swarm. The second wave of American planes arrived about an hour after the first. Another 150 aircraft. The Yamato was already badly damaged, listing to port, her deck on fire in multiple places. But she was still afloat. And her guns were still firing. The attack was relentless. The torpedo bombers coordinated their strikes, hitting the Yamato on one side to capsize her faster. The dive bombers concentrated on the superstructure, the bridge, the fire control systems, the anti-aircraft positions. The American pilots had studied the Yamato's design. They knew exactly where to aim. The torpedo bombers were ordered to attack the port side only, one side, not both. A ship hit on both sides will sink more or less level. A ship hit repeatedly on one side will capsize. That was the plan. Flip the Yamato over like a turtle. The dive bombers targeted the superstructure, the bridge, the rangefinders, the anti-aircraft directors. The idea was to blind and deafen the ship, to make it impossible for her to coordinate her defense. The fighters strafed the exposed anti-aircraft gunners, who had almost no armor protection. It was methodical, it was brutal, and it worked. The captain, Kosaku Aruga, remained on the bridge, calmly giving orders even as the ship was dying around him. Below decks, the situation was hell. The flooding was out of control. The damage control teams fought desperately, but the ship was taking on water faster than they could pump it out. The wounded were carried to the hospital, but the hospital was already overflowing. Men lay on the floor, bleeding, burned, waiting for help that would never come. One of the most tragic details: the Yamato's massive main guns could not depress low enough to fire at the low-flying torpedo bombers. The great cannons that were supposed to sink enemy battleships were useless against aircraft. The Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells made a terrifying display. Great bursts of fire and smoke, but they were inaccurate and often jammed in the barrels. The gunners were dying for nothing. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, the young officer who had written his farewell letter, later described the scene. He was on the bridge, watching the American planes circle like sharks. He saw his friends die. He saw the captain, standing motionless, staring out at the burning sea. Yoshida thought, "This is the end. This is what it means to die for the Emperor." By the third wave of attacks, the Yamato was doomed. The list to port was so severe that the crew couldn't stand upright. The engines were failing. The ammunition stores were on fire. The order was given to abandon ship. But many of the sailors never had a chance. Act 7. The Death of a Giant. At around 2:20 p.m., the Yamato's forward ammunition magazine exploded. The explosion that destroyed the Yamato was so powerful that it was felt by ships dozens of kilometers away. The smoke column rose over 6,000 meters into the sky. For a few seconds, the sun was blotted out. Then the smoke cleared and the sea was empty. The greatest battleship ever built was gone. Of the 3,332 men on board, only 276 survived. The rest went down with the ship, killed by explosions, by fire, by drowning, by the cold. The survivors were picked up by the remaining Japanese destroyers and taken back to Japan. Many of them were wounded. All of them were haunted. The blast was colossal. A mushroom cloud rose thousands of meters into the sky. The explosion was so powerful that it was seen by observers in Japan, over 100 kilometers away. The Yamato's hull split open, and the ship that had been called unsinkable rolled over and began to plunge beneath the waves. The sea swallowed the Yamato. Men were pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship. Those who survived were left floating in the water, covered in oil, surrounded by burning wreckage. The American planes, their work done, flew away. The surviving Japanese destroyers moved in to rescue the survivors. But out of a crew of over 3,300 men, fewer than 300 were saved. Captain Aruga went down with his ship. He was last seen on the bridge, strapping himself to the wheel so he would not float away. He wanted to die with his vessel, like a true captain. His body was never recovered. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru was one of the survivors. He was pulled from the water, barely alive. He would later write a memoir of the Yamato's final voyage, one of the most powerful eyewitness accounts of war ever written. The loss of the Yamato was a death blow to the Japanese Navy. Not because the ship was strategically vital, by 1945 it wasn't, but because it was the last symbol of Japanese naval power. After the Yamato, there was nothing left. The empire was finished. Act 8. The Aftermath. The sinking of the Yamato had profound psychological effects on both sides. For Japan, the sacrifice was immense but pointless. The ship died, the men died, and Okinawa fell anyway. For the United States, the sinking was a propaganda victory, but also a sobering reminder of the fanaticism of their enemy. If Japan was willing to send its greatest warship on a suicide mission, what else was it willing to do? The Yamato's wreck sat on the seabed for decades, silent and unseen. It was discovered in 1985 by a research team. The wreck is in two main pieces, the bow and the stern, lying at a depth of about 340 meters. The hull is torn open. The guns have spilled out onto the seabed. It is a gravesite, and it is treated with reverence by those who explore it. In Japan, the Yamato has become a cultural icon, not of militarism, but of sacrifice, beauty, and tragedy. The ship has been the subject of movies, anime series, and countless books. The Yamato Museum in Kure, near where the ship was built, houses a massive-scale model and artifacts recovered from the wreck. Every year, thousands of visitors come to pay their respects. Conclusion. The Yamato is a reminder that even the mightiest machines are nothing against the tide of history. She was built for a war that had already changed by the time she launched. She was sent to die because her commanders could not bear to let her survive in defeat. And she took 3,000 souls with her to the bottom of the East China Sea. If you believe these stories matter, stories about the human cost of war, the tragedy of blind devotion, and the sheer scale of what humanity is capable of building and destroying, then hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves history. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're going to keep telling the forgotten stories, and there are so many left to tell. Thanks for watching, and remember the Yamato, a floating fortress, a steel coffin, and a tombstone for an age.